Thanks very much, members of the press. Before I commence my speech to address the economic policy of the United Australia Party in this election, I wanted to make some general comments. I'd like to apologise for not appearing last month, but as you know, I contracted COVID Delta strain at a time when I already had a double pneumonia, so it was a life-threatening disease, otherwise I would have been here. Not being vaccinated, I was fortunate to be able to participate in an existing trial for an effective treatment which has so far had around 600 participants and no deaths. Within 48 hours of starting the treatment, my fever had abated, my oxygen levels had returned to normal, and I felt greatly improved. What can we learn from this? Firstly, I realise that once you have a COVID, vaccines can't help you. Second, we have some remarkable drugs which are approved and are effective beyond their original use. Thirdly, that we should empower our doctors to use medications off-label if, in their view, it will help a patient. The Helsinki Convention supports this approach. Finally, we need a widely available treatment to fight this pandemic once people have caught COVID, be they vaccinated or not. Why? Because over 6,000 COVID-19 patients have died in Australia alone. In spite of vaccination, the number of cases is not dropping as the virus mutates. The good news is that there is a work underway on this Australian cocktail of medications, similar to one that I took, which has showed remarkable success in treating hundreds of Australians, and it will be available in the near future to beat the pandemic and to get our lives back to normal. 5 days after undergoing the treatment program, I was free of COVID and commencing a long and a hard road to recovery. In Australia, we've experienced death from COVID in both vaccinated and unvaccinated people. We can't abandon vaccinated people or unvaccinated people when they have COVID. Both groups deserve the best available treatments to save their lives. I hope the TGA and others will offer all Australians hope and approve a series of treatments to allow Australians to receive the best treatments that are available to fight this disease and to save their lives, for both prevention and treatment for those who have contracted COVID. On the 12th of March 2022, Dr John Gerard, Chief Health Officer for Queensland, revoked the ban on hydroxychloroquine. He said he did it to assist in the containing and the spread of COVID-19. It was a recognition that the real data overseas in a number of countries had been significant for treatments. Although hydroxychloroquine wasn't a treatment that I had in particular, it does show, and it does show recognition by government, that we have to look to treatments as we come to live with this disease. In respect of the budget, I want to thank Josh Frydenberg for the once and only $250 payment to deal with the cost of living. After all, $250 payment works out $1.60 a week over the term of the next parliament. If ever Australians wanted to know how concerned the Liberal Party was with Australians, they know now because they've been given $1.60 a week. But of course the Labor Party's offered them nothing. The United Australia Party believes that Australia and Australians can do better for their population. We meet today in a city known for its resilience, among people known for their courage. And we find our country needs both courage and resilience in the times that we are to face ahead. I'd like to acknowledge my parliamentary leader of the United Australia Party, Craig Kelly, and the United Party Senate team leaders which have come here from Tasmania, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, as well as our other endorsed candidates that are here for the House of Representatives. I've been appointed by Craig Kelly as a spokesman responsible for Treasury matters, and Dominic Martino, the former head of Deloitte's in Sydney, has been appointed Managing Director, to manage the finance portfolio. Together we lead the economic team facing Josh Frydenberg from the Liberal Party and Jim Chalmers, both of which have got limited experience when it comes to business and real life. So you'll find the approach that I outlined to you today a different one than you've heard from the Liberal and Labor Party, tackling the problems that we face in this country from a different angle, mainly because of experience that we've had in the business world in dealing with billions of dollars multiple times in our lives over many years. We think that experience should be available for the nation. I know that it's said that over the last year that I've increased my wealth by $9 billion. I didn't think it was that much. But hopefully we want to adopt some of those techniques to show you how we can face the real problems facing it. Let me just say that so-called full employment at wages and living standards, which have declined in real terms, is not an achievement. The lower you put the cost of wages and labour down, of course you're going to get more and more uptake. It works like a pendulum or anything. But what we should be looking at, if we want success, is a rising living standard where Australians can enjoy all they could be, and this country could be more prosperous. Today, I intend setting out the real economic crisis facing the nation and how it must be addressed to save every Australian from the economic catastrophe we are now facing. It's the elephant in the room that both the Liberal and Labor parties fail to address, or even to inform the Australian people of the impending crisis in their lives. It's the level of debt that the Morrison and Labor governments have run up, and how that level of debt will affect interest rates and current home ownership in Australia, and how it would allow the control of our country to pass to foreign interests. I will also highlight some other policies of the United Australia Party which we intend to take to the election, and provide you with an outline of what the United Australia Party, now Australia's largest political party, is doing in the campaign at the next federal election. Australia faces $1 trillion of debt, unprecedented in the nation's history. You've all been given a publication from the European Central Bank, which is a study on public debt and long-term interest rates in the economies of Germany and Italy and the United States, setting out the relationship, the interaction between the two from the years 1993 to 2003. It gives you the basis on how we've been able to model what's going to happen in this country. And it's the results that I want to bring to you and explain to you. We can see from that data that high interest rates has virtually no effect on short-term interest rates for a period of 1 to 2 years. But after that, things change. And we're just reaching the end of that 2-year period at the moment. And what changes, you can start to see it happening, is an increase in home loan interest rates, for example. It demonstrates that if we assume we've got a home loan interest rate of 2% today, that within 1 year it'll be 4%, then 6%, and then 8%, where it quadruples. And we have to look at our mortgages. Already in Australia, 40% of Australians are suffering from mortgage stress. Mortgage stress is defined as being you've spent your disposable income and you've got less than 5% less. When the mortgage rate rises to 4%, 60% of our mortgages fail in this country. When it rises to 4%, 60% fail. When it rises to 6%, 80% of mortgages fail in this country. Already, just last week, the Commonwealth Bank predicted there'll be 4 home loan increases this year. The chief of the IMF has confirmed that it's inevitable that rates will rise. And in the US, the Federal Reserve plans to raise interest rate 4 times again in 2022. Inflation is raising its head in Australia, with price escalation for fuel, energy and basic commodities. And after the election, we'll face runaway inflation, which will lead to higher interest rates, which will devastate Australian families and businesses and destroy the independence and freedom of the nation. Inflation in the United Kingdom is currently at 6.2%. In the United States, it's reached 7.9%. So these things are inevitable. That's what we're facing. So we have to do something to fix it. The real economic damage of the pandemic, the economic damage, was what we're facing now in interest rates. And that's what we have to address. During the pandemic, the government and Scotty from marketing has racked up over $1 trillion debt. And our record debt-breaking treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, has nothing to do with it. As George Harrison said in the 1980s, if you don't know where you're going to, any road will take you there. And Frydenberg says sometime in the future, sometime after the next 10 years, after he has left Parliament, Australia can repay down our debt. But at that rate that he's projecting, the projected interest rates, I estimate if Australia doesn't act now, it'll take 180 years to get this nation back to where it was when John Howard left office. We don't have 180 years to act. So Morrison's plan won't save Australians from defaulting on their loans, and won't stop Australian homes and assets from being sold to foreign interests who would be the only buyers with money in the market as Australians lose their homes because of increased home loan rates. And you can imagine the social disruption in our country when that happens. We've been a country where the Australian dream is to own your own home, when many of our small businesses function because homes have provided security for banks, employ many of our people. So this is a major challenge to Australia as we know it. It's a social, it's an economic, it's a financial change, and it's not identified. It's not talked about by the Liberal Party or the Labor Party. Maybe they know that it's coming, and maybe they think they can't do anything about it, and we're just going to wait there and win the next election. It's very significant. It's very significant that the budget was for 6 months. I think it's for the first 6 months budget I've ever seen, right? And of course, when all this happens, those Australians that haven't got a mortgage but have invested in their house at high rates of sale in the market will see the value of their properties crash and a reduction of their wealth. So all in all, what we're facing is a massive attack upon our country and our social fabric, and it has to be addressed. The real goal of the so-called pandemic could have been an excuse to provide the Australian government to recklessly borrow and destroy Australia's independence and the country's economic independence. Either way, we've got to stop from what's happening to protect and defend the livelihood of all Australians. Australians must act now by using the levers of government to avoid the crisis. Unless Australia's unprecedented debt is urgently remedied, it will cause all mortgages to default. As interest rates rise, it will cause Australians to lose their homes and it will remove the underlying security for all of our small businesses. There's a great reset, and you've heard that word before, a great reset coming, and it's inevitable, thanks to the Liberal and Labor parties and to a totally incompetent public service who has little regard for the interests of everyday Australians. Australia must act now to save Australian homes, to save our country and our economy, and to protect our freedom and our independence. The Reserve Bank Board makes decisions about monetary policy, independent of the political process. So it does it, and it does not accept instruction from the Australian government on the day-to-day monetary policy of our country. The principle of central bank independence and its operation of monetary policy in pursuit of accepted goals has been the international norm from the mid-80s. It prevents the use of monetary policy for political ends. Consequently, the Reserve Bank has no accountability to the Australian people, but rather to so-called international norms. You know, that was not always the case in this country. It was not the case when Robert Menzies was United Australia Party Prime Minister in the 30s, or when he was Prime Minister under the Liberal Party. And it won't be the case after the federal election if the United Australia Party has anything to say about it. Australia faces a crisis with around 80% of the holders of mortgages in this country likely to lose their homes, and Australia faces an unprecedented national emergency. The government of this country must move to protect and defend all Australians from that outcome, regardless of international pressure. Under Craig Kelly's leadership, the United Australia Party is to reassert the government control it has under the Constitution and exercise it in this unprecedented high debt time for the benefit of all Australians by setting a maximum cap on the interest rates for all housing loans of less than 3% per annum for the next 5 years. This is an emergency that we face in this country like any other. In times of war, hardship and the Depression, the government has had to act. But the timing of the government acting is very important. We can't leave it any longer. We've got to ensure that our people and our financial structure in this nation remain solid and strong, that we have the environment where our children can be brought up with some security. We must protect all Australians, and we must protect their assets and our way of life. This crisis has been created by men and women, and so it can be solved by men and women. But only the United Party is facing up to the challenge and has an immediate solution to take the nation's debt away from the determiners of public and fiscal policy and to ensure that all Australians may keep their home and small businesses and rely on capital generated, which rely on the capital generated by home loan mortgages. The national crisis is we must preserve the wealth of each Australian currently has and preserve home ownership, which has been the cornerstone of our country for 70 years. The United Australia Party has high on its agenda the implementation of policies that will allow Australians to enter the home market for the first time. Australians can never trust Liberal, Labor or the Greens they've sold out our country. How then will the United Australia Party save our country, save you from losing your home long term? Firstly, by dealing with the $1 trillion of debt head on, by implementing measures designed to protect the Australian economy and to impact the failures of the political class of Australians represented by the Liberal and Labor parties. Australian iron ore is supplying the boom in manufacturing in Asia, upon which the economies of Japan, Korea and China and the rest of Asia depend. Asia is reliant on Australian iron ore. Without it, Asian economies cannot function. That's the reality. Tens of trillions of dollars has been invested in China, Japan and Korea based on the supply of Australian iron ore. Their supply chain and the prosperity of their people, tens and hundreds of millions of them, depend upon receiving exports of Australian iron ore and are linked to our country. Australia has become a quarry upon which Asia and Asian countries base their prosperity. This becomes apparent when we consider the iron ore market supplies over 75% of the Asian market. And all of those exports that you see from China that go to the United States, that go to Europe, all come and all start in this country. South American infrastructure and production cannot be expanded from what it currently is. And infrastructure in Africa is a nightmare. Australia is the dominant and only supplier of iron ore growth to Asian economies and is at the bottom of the food chain. While Asian economies expand and benefit from low-priced Australian iron ore and use their financial clout to punish this country when they know how vulnerable their economies are to Australia, but when our politicians lack the courage needed to protect and defend our country and to get the best bargain for our citizens, we know we need to act. Australia must act now to save our country from catastrophe that's about to destroy our economic prosperity and the security of our families. In the 1960s, the Australian government had an export licence on our iron ore. Many nations in Asia, such as Indonesia, have in recent times introduced export licences for their nickel and other resources, as the growth of world trade and the accelerations of export has required their national interests to be protected so that they ensure that their interests are preserved. The United Australia Party will introduce a 15% export licence for all iron ore exports from this country and will pledge the proceeds from that licence to be used for the retirement of the $1 trillion mountain of debt that Australia faces. So immediately when those measures are taken, that goes on our balance sheet, if you like, that we've got a way of repaying our debt from revenue coming from our export licence, and that can be calculated. We've calculated that over a 20-year period, it will eliminate all of the debt Australia faces, right? And it will also save Australia's AAA credit rating immediately. In the meantime, the United Australia Party will use its power under the Constitution to put a cap on bank home loan lending rate of maximum of 3% for the next 5 years. As I said, we'll save 6 million Australian homes and defend the prosperity of freedom of all Australian families and the independence of our country. We cannot allow a whole country to be disposed of or dispossessed just because Labor and Liberal parties have recklessly run up debt without any sort of accountability to the Australian people. We cannot stand by and not protect and defend our country because what we face at the moment in Asia is an economic war. It's a war against different interests, and I've been part of that war for a long time. I've stood across the negotiating tables with many heads of government and others that want resources in this country, and I've seen the ruthless scenarios that they have because they're desperate. They're desperate for our iron ore, and they rejoice in the fact that we have weak public servants who lack leadership, and we have weak politicians who wouldn't know what to do, and they laugh about them over drinks. And I've seen that happen with me, with others, in various economies of Asia. And we can't let them laugh any longer. We've got to stand up and claim our rightful place in this country because we're in a critical situation. We're at 1 minute to midnight. We can't allow that to happen. So these two policies are fundamental to our country. We want to introduce them. We have the courage and the strength and the experience to follow through on them. You've seen Josh Frydenberg with his budget speech. It's more of the same. He speaks in many tongues, but doesn't say anything significant in economic sense. And the same's true with Jim. You know, he's spent a lot of time in university, but not much time in the real world. We need to save our AAA credit rating. Australia is the fourth largest holder of pension fund assets in the world. Australian super funds have over $3.5 trillion, much of it invested in North America and Europe, which does not provide any economic growth or employment for our citizens. So just as John Curtin in World War II brought back our troops back to Australia to defend this country in a time of war, the United Australia Party wants to bring back Australian super to defend Australia in its time of economic crisis. Under any United Australia Party government, at least $1 trillion of Australian super invested offshore in shares in North America and Europe will be required to be returned to this country for investment in our country, in our people. And we know through experience that less or just over 50% of Australians ever receive their super because they die in the meantime. We want to give them a real benefit now so that they can see the economic growth in this country, they can create jobs, and we can project ahead a real and positive future. I've got to see how much longer I've got. $1 trillion of growth injected into our economy is much more beneficial for the Australian people than the $250 that the Liberal Party offered us in cost of living increases. Right? It's projected in 2041, Australia will have $9.5 trillion in super. And when that super is paid, the person contributing it gets it all tax-free. The government's giving them that concession. So it's a fair go that that money comes back in this country, that it's invested here for our economic growth. Because if we go back to the time of the beginning of the last century, the common denominator for our economic growth has been that Australia is devoid of capital, that we need more capital, and we become dependent on other countries. The facts are today we have the capital. It's just not deployed the right way. It's just that our government doesn't know what to do with it. And we've seen the incompetence during the pandemic of economic management in this country. So we need to get experienced people behind it to do the best with what we've got. Why should the Indonesians have an export licence for nickel to protect their industry? And of course it's been accepted in the market. When Australians see tariffs put on their wine, see them run down by other hostile countries around us, well, are we that weak that we can't stand up and protect ourselves? Further, one of Australia's long-standing policies to stop tax being paid in advance by businesses at the beginning of the year before they've made any profit will be abolished, so that Australians who run our small businesses will only pay their tax at the end of every financial year like other Australian entities. The Australian government is the largest petitioner of bankruptcies of our small businesses. And when they do that, they put Australians out of work. They have an increased welfare budget, and your money goes to protect them. We can create thousands of jobs and turbocharge exports by processing our own minerals here in Australia, leading to an enormous revenue injection, and which can be used for better schools and hospitals. We want to see the government play a key role in facilitating the setting up of new export industries for Australia, much as they did for BHP in the start of the last century. Australia can process its own minerals instead of exports worth a few $100s a tonne. We want exports worth over $10,000 a tonne to balance our payments and to provide jobs for our own people that are skilled. The Commonwealth can use the increased financial strength that these measures will bring to invest, among other things, in our health facilities. Because despite the $1 trillion of debt run up by Morrison, there has been no increase in real investment in our hospital system in the last 2 years. Shame, shame on Morrison and Albanese for playing politics with Australia's health, for not providing the resources that we need. We cannot tolerate Australians dying in corridors of hospitals that I've seen when I went to hospital. There was no beds for them. There was no resources. And in many cases we had wards, but they weren't staffed. Government didn't find that as a high priority. It wasn't as high a priority as it was for Pine establishing these submarines down in South Australia, or for Turnbull wasting $5 billion of Australian money on French submarines. Priority in government's important, and the priority has got to be our health. And in that way, because of our policy in dealing with the $1 trillion of Liberal Labor debt, we'll be in a position to provide $40 billion of additional funding for healthcare right across Australia, not to state governments but directly to hospitals, so that we have a real impact on what's happening. And our senior citizens are paid less than many being supported by government. We must change this as soon as possible. As a first step, the United Australia Party government will increase the pension by $180 a fortnight. And how can we do that? Because we've eliminated the $1 trillion of debt. We've reorganised it, right? And we've protected Australia. And we've brought us, from economic terms, back to where we were with John Howard, because we've got a scheme and a revenue that pays off and down that debt in an acceptable time. We must protect the nation's integrity. One hostile nuclear submarine between Singapore and Australia means in 60 days' time this nation closes down. We need nuclear submarines, but not in 40 years' time. We need them now. And the United States has got them. They've just retired a number of Los Angeles attack submarines that could be based in Hawaii, that could protect and defend this country, and can be purchased for a pittance of what the Liberal Party is paying for these other subs in 40 years' time. But, of course, there's not commissions in it for the lobbyists. There's not commissions in it for those people that stand in the middle that control our policy. There's just good economics and good defence policy. We need those now. Our regional communities are the backbone of the nation. The United Australia Party is committed to economic growth in rural areas. Our cities are bursting at the seams. We face heavy congestion, serious housing affordability issues and mounting costs of living. By providing a 20% tax concession incentive to people living more than 200 kilometres from the city, we can decentralise Australia, encourage people to move and settle in our regional areas, thereby providing Australians with a lower cost of living and housing affordability, and ensuring that existing infrastructure in the cities is sufficient to serve members of the community. At rallies in every capital city and regional centres, Australians and our party members and their supporters have made it clear to government that enough is enough. Freedom demonstrations across Australia have been attended by more people than Jim Cairns' moratoriums in the Vietnam War. Governments never give back freedom when they take it from the people. The people have to take it back. We now know that freedom is the real target. Freedom to own a home, freedom to be economically independent. No government can take our freedom. No government gave us our freedom. The graves of over 100,000 young Australians, which are littered around the globe, gave you your freedom. At places like Gallipoli, Beersheba, the Western Desert, Yip, Tobruk, Normandy, Kokoda, Milne Bay, the Coral Sea, Vietnam, Timor and Afghanistan. And everywhere on this planet where Australians have sacrificed for you and for your freedom, they've given you freedom. No government can take it back from the Australian people, and no government should get away with it. And everywhere on this, in 2022, the trumpet sounds again to a new generation of Australians. The call has been answered by over 80,000 Australians who have joined the United Australia Party. Save Australia we must, save Australia we will, save Australian homes and families. The United Party will save Australia's independence. We must save this country from what they're planning after the election. Liberal and Labors are being very nice to us before the election, but after the election they'll lock us down forever and implement fundamental changes in our lives and surrender total control to the government. A 6-month budget confirms that there's something else ahead of you. And the $1.60 a week, which translate over the life of the next parliament, demonstrate that Australians don't need insulting handouts from government, but what will happen in 6 months' time? We need freedom and opportunity to be all we can be. The United Australia Party is committed to save Australians from the overreach of power and unwanted control and suppression that both sides of government want to give us.
Mr. Palmer, just conscious on time.
Okay.
We have a lot of freedom-loving journalists in the audience, so perhaps
Well,
a final message to go on, if that's okay.
Okay, so we'll give you about another 30 minutes. But anyway, so the message for all Australians is that if you're happy with all that's being done now, if you believe that Scott Morrison and Albanese really represent your interest, you can vote again for them. But for all the other reasons I've set out, if you believe, as I do, that an interest rate of no more than 3% on home loans for the next 5 years will secure you and your family's history, even if you work for the ABC, I believe we must use Australia's advantage to repay the $1 trillion of debt the Liberal and Labor parties have burdened Australians with, and if you believe that we should bring back $1 trillion of super to Australia to seek investment for higher wages and a better living standard as we go forward in this century, then you must vote for the United Australia Party. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. You can take a seat if you'd like for the questions. Or stay.
I'll stand up.
I'm being told to stay up. There you go. Stay
And see everybody.
Look, we've got perhaps an election slightly bereft of big ideas. There are plenty of them there. I might start on the one where you're essentially capping mortgage rates for households, so of 3% or less. You also said you were concerned about inflation. Mm-hmm. Inflation would skyrocket if you capped mortgages that low.
Well, that's true. I think what we've got to realise that we're in an unusual situation as a country. We're saying that the wealth of middle-class Australia is at stake, right? And we've just got to look at different alternatives, right? And we've got to we say that we need to preserve that as the highest priority, just as we would preserve the security of the nation in time of war.
But let inflation run.
No, I don't think let inflation run. There's other things we can do about inflation. And, of course, it's to do with the money supply and how that's handled. But we're not talking about general interest rates. We're talking about home loan interest rates when we say we cap interest rates at 3%.
But you mentioned business loans as well.
Well, that's in a situation where many small businesses utilise the security of their home and operate in their business. They're not technically business loans, they're home loans, but often businesses use that as an overdraft facility or something like that.
Okay. The other aspect, you mentioned you're very concerned about government debt.
Yeah.
If you're going to cap those interest rates and banks are financing partly with money offshore, either they're going to stop loaning or the government might have to subsidise those loans. So that's going to add to government debt.
Well, if that's the case, right, and I don't think that will be the case, I think we can legislate to limit home loans, because if you look back in the 60s and the 70s, that's how the interest rates operated in this country. And if you look to the RBA Act, it particularly says that interest rates should be set in accordance with international norms. It doesn't relate it back to Australia's needs. So we disagree with that. We think all the policies of government should be aimed at what's best for Australia first. So that's a change in monetary policy.
Right, but legislating's fine. Banks don't have to stay open and keep loaning if they're losing money.
Well, it's not a question of keep loaning. It's a question that they've already lent, and there's a lot of people's future that's on the line.
All right. We might move to questions. Nobody follow my example and just keep it to one question. Amanda Kopp is first.
Hi, Amanda Kopp from the Community Radio Network and National Radio News. We broadcast to over 100 community radio stations around the country. Thank you so much for your speech. Your party won no seats at the last election despite your enormous spend. Why not just go to the Liberal Party and use your money there?
Well, first of all, we think we want to make sure that these ideas get out into the Australian society. For example, our Senator D.O. Wang in 2013 was the first person to introduce the idea of a federal ICAC, and we've seen both the Labor and Liberal Party adopt that. So what really matters in politics is policies and outcomes. And I think the ideas that I've expounded today, you haven't heard from the Liberal Party, you haven't heard it from the Labor Party, and Australians need to hear it. I don't think you can look at the 2019 election. I think before that election I indicated that people should vote for Scott Morrison first, so we reduced our vote by saying that, and we still got 3.5% of the vote. But the reality was, the reason I did that was I didn't want Australia to rack up debts and be in the position we're now facing. And what we found is that Morrison adopted worse policies than Labor in relation to the amount of debt that we've had. So this is a critical thing. When we look at the cost of JobSaver and Keeper and all those sort of things, it comes to less than $200 billion. But our debt's going to be over $1.3 trillion in the next couple of years. So where's all the money gone? So you've got to think that they're pretty hopeless, the people we've got there running it at the moment. They need a good shake-up. So I think we're giving them a good shake-up.
Thank you.
Sarah Ison from The Australian.
Sarah Ison from the Oz. Just following on from that, I would really like to ask about your preferences in the for the UAP and for the election. Who is your party going to suggest as number 2? And if there is a hung parliament as well, a lot of the independents I've spoken to haven't said who they'll support, but can you tell us today, if there is a hung parliament, who you'd like UAP people in parliament to be supporting?
Well, I can give you a quick answer where we are at the moment,
Yeah.
and not try to avoid the question, right? And that is, I'm the leader of the Senate team across Australia, and when you vote for the Senate, you've got to number 6 squares, right, to recommend people for your preferences. And I can tell you that in none of those squares will be the Liberal, Labor or Greens, right? There'll be no preferences given by our party to those parties in that situation. In the House of Representatives, if it's different, you have to number every square. So I can just say that, you know, the Greens, the Liberals and the Labor will be at the bottom of that ticket. And because the nominations haven't closed, we don't know who's standing in what place. We can't determine at this stage who will be out of the last 3, but they'll all be the last 3.
What about Labor versus Liberal, though?
I don't think there's a, there's a clear-cut thing. This is me personally speaking, because other people have got inputs besides me. But if you look, like if you think of our policies about no mandatory vaccination, no mandatory vaccine passports, and these things went up in the Parliament, we've seen some people cross the floor with Craig Kelly and support them. So it would be, you know, those sort of people would be people that we would think to naturally that we should preference. But whether that extends to the whole party is difficult to say, right?
Andrew Probyn.
Mr. Palmer, Andrew Probyn from your favourite, the ABC.
It's great,
Look,
the ABC.
on preferences, you've dodged the question, and because you are the money bags behind your party, you claim to be only responsible for
Tell
the
my
Senate.
wife that. She doesn't think I've got so much money.
You're the $9 billion money bags, as you've just told us.
Yeah.
You said before that Australians can never trust the Liberals, Labor
or the
Greens again, but then you later said that Scott Morrison adopted worse policies than Labor.
Yep.
So when it comes to that big paper that we all have to fill out, what is your order? That 1, 2, 3,
You mean
right
for
at
the
the
Senate
bottom.
paper or the House of Reps?
For the House of Reps.
Well, we haven't determined that, because not only in a political party, even though I am the money bags, right, it doesn't mean I make all the decisions, and we've got a number of people.
I doubt that.
Well, it doesn't mean that. And as I said to you, there are Liberal members of Parliament who have crossed the floor with Craig Kelly. That's on the record. There are other senators in the Liberal Party that have also supported him. There's people like people who've also sponsored some of our bills that we put up, like George from Dawson. So naturally, those people will be favourable when it comes to us. But there is also a situation where the Liberal Party locked down Sydney. And there are a lot of our party members that are very upset about that still, right? And they've got a say in what happens in New South Wales. So we're looking at that. There's also the situation with Labor, where we had Dan Andrews having the biggest lockdown in the world's history, and Mark McGowan.
Right, can I have another crack? You've got a Liberal turncoat over here as your leader.
That's not true.
You've mentioned George Christensen. He's retiring. At a previous, I think, a state election, I think it was WA state election, you decided that you would put the sitting member last in each of your how to put vote cards. Is that a possibility?
Well, I think we'll be looking at who nominates, because we don't know at this stage. I know in the Senate, for example.
Well, you do know who's nominated, don't you?
We don't, because they're not closed yet, and there are a lot of independents this time. The Robert Holmes of Court's got a team of people standing, as you know.
But when you look at who's last out of Labor and Liberal, we know the situation there. You know what you're choosing between. Would you look at incumbency, punishing incumbency across the board?
Well, that's a possibility. That's been put up by some of our members at the moment. But I think one of the things too, I think from my personal perspective, I think I'd put the Greens ahead of Liberal and Labor. That's my personal perspective, because they haven't been in government and they haven't been responsible for this debt. And the debt we see is causing the main problem in Australia. So, like the ABC, I'd be putting the Greens ahead of Liberal and Labor.
Okay.
I'll take that as comment.
Next question from Lisa Vicenton.
Mr. Palmer, Lisa Vicenton from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Just want to ask you about advertising spend. We know you've already spent more than $30 million and we haven't even hit the campaign proper yet. By the time the election concludes, how much will you have spent? What will this campaign cost you? And to that end, you've been accused of trying to buy the election and you've been accused of being a threat to democracy purely because you can so heavily outspend your opponents. How do you respond to those claims? Well,
I don't think we do heavily outspend our opponents. If you look at the last election, you've looked at the money the Labor and Liberal Party spend nationally, and it was pretty similar. That's the first thing. Secondly, I'd say that between now and the election, we'll spend about $40 million. Because we don't get any coverage on the ABC, unfortunately. We don't get many interviews there. And we don't get general coverage by news generally. So if you balance the number of articles against the number of ads, you'd find that our ideas are less prominent than the traditional parties. But we do believe in a democracy, and democracy means diversity of ideas, and that people have got a right to come forward and say what they think. What matters not is how much money you spend, it's what your solutions are. Whether I've put forward today solutions which are novel and new and which people can debate about. And that's good for democracy, if you disagree with us or not. I'd fight as hard as I could to protect Mr Albanese's right to say something. But suddenly if I want to say something, or our party wants to say something, it's a threat to democracy. And I just don't accept that.
So about a $70 million total spend?
Roughly, I'd say.
That's less than last time.
It could be, but of course media rates have gone down because circulations have got smaller in papers.
You did promise us... You did promise us the most expensive campaign in political history this time round.
Well, we'll see if we can boost it. My wife will have to give me some more money and I'll see what I can do.
You complain about not getting your message out there, being a threat to democracy. Some of the reasons you don't seem to be getting as much airtime is straight-out misinformation around COVID. Do you regret any messages you put out earlier during the pandemic?
Well, not really, because, I mean, they've been proven to be true. The Queensland... As I said, it's currently now the Queensland Chief Medical Officer, for example, on hydroxychloroquine. Today has taken the ban off it, has made positive statements that that's...
Mainly to do with supply. So the big issue there was they didn't have enough supply if it was going to be widely...
Hold on. I just should check. I didn't want to go into this, but I'm happy to go into it. I donated 37 million doses of hydroxychloroquine to the Australian government. That cost me $35 million of my money. The government didn't complain about it. They took it at the time because it was the only thing that they thought would work. And that was before the pharma companies and the lobbyists in New South Wales and elsewhere who run the Liberal Party got involved in the act. That was before tens of millions of dollars were paid to lobbyists by pharma companies. That was before at Monash University, Bill Gates gave over $20 million to the people of the so-called advisory committee on COVID. And then, only then, was hydroxychloroquine said to be so dangerous to you. Only then, when a trial was done in Europe at 3 times the toxic dose and wrongly reported misinformation in Lancelot, was hydroxychloroquine no good.
Just to jump in, so the issue that TGA's had with hydroxychloroquine is not saying it's necessarily often dangerous. It's more about efficacy of it in terms of treating COVID. So that's been the TGA line on that.
Well, I'm here today. Yeah, that's all I can say to you. I'm here today, and the Queensland Government's Chief Medical Officer...
Let me put this other one before we go to the next question.
Let me just finish this one point. The Queensland Government's Chief Medical Officer, at his direction on the 12th of March, has said he needs hydroxychloroquine to stop the spread of COVID. And he wouldn't say that, and also to treat COVID. The Queensland Government wouldn't say that unless it was true, would they?
I'm not really sure about the statement of stopping the spread of COVID. We might come back to that. But let me just take you this finally. One of your very prominent ads was 210 deaths. It says COVID-19 vaccine, 210 deaths.
Yeah.
When will they stop?
That's right.
Only 11 deaths were from the vaccine. Other deaths occurred after it. Isn't that important to get that right if you want to go by the official TGA
and you are
data?
right, it is wrong. Today it's over 1,222 deaths, which is on the... Hold on. Which are reported deaths on the TGA owned data.
This is the important difference here. So the deaths on the TGA website, the deaths from the vaccine versus deaths after are very different. 11 deaths on the website are from the vaccine, and that was after a first dose of AstraZeneca. They are the only deaths from vaccines in Australia.
Well, I have to correct you, right? There's not a death from vaccines unless you've been fully vaccinated, had 2 doses and a booster at the moment, or they don't report it.
That's not true.
Yeah, well, that is true, because I can tell you that myself, that I've got personal knowledge of people who have had the vaccine and died within a couple of days, right? That's not a lot of people, but there's people that have got that.
I don't want to veer into anecdotal.
But
do you concede, you use quotes from the TGA, do you concede that
Well, the TGA is funded by pharma companies.
But you quoted the TGA, but you selectively quoted them.
Yeah, because at that time when that was issued, there was 210 reported deaths on the TGA.
After a vaccine, but not from.
Yeah, after a vaccine, that's right.
Not from.
Yeah, but at the same time, the TGA only had carried out 3 or 4 autopsies. They require an autopsy to be carried out, and they assume that if an autopsy is not carried out, the vaccine didn't cause it.
Because they have investigations onto other possible deaths, and an autopsy is only carried out when necessary.
Well, all I'm saying to you is that that was my view, and it's also if you look at the the data in the United States, you'll see it runs to the thousands, and the same with the UK.
Again, it's from rather than after, but I want to get other journalists.
Let's just look at these vaccines have never been through our system. Anyway, next question.
Hey,
I should get questions.
Ben Westcott, please.
Thanks. Ben Westcott from Bloomberg News. We've talked a lot about before the election, but say you're successful, say that you win a seat in the Senate and that you hold the balance of power. I mean, what are you going to ask whoever forms government for on condition? What sort of legislation are you going to be looking for them to pass as a guarantee for your vote?
Well, I guess if the things we've raised today, such as home loan interest rates, are very important, we think, to people in Australia, and also repaying the debt. And we've put forward what we think is a very viable scheme of repaying the debt, where it takes this country immediately into a level of solvency, if you like, and will protect its AAA credit rating. I mean, they're the two big issues that are important, as well as the freedom in Australia that we need to have from mandated vaccines and from people's jobs depending upon their being vaccinated. They're the policies we think is important, but all of them we'd put in one parcel, and that is Craig Kelly stood at the last election as a Liberal. He stood for small government, for small debt, and for a lot of freedoms that are traditional Liberal freedoms. He's standing at this election for the same things. He hasn't changed, the Liberal Party's changed.
Next question from Phil Curry.
Hi, Mr. Palmer. Phil Curry from the Financial
Phil.
Review. How you going? Can I just ask you back to your policy announcements, your export licence on iron ore and your cap on mortgages. First, would the export licence apply to your own iron ore interests?
Yes, it would, yeah.
Secondly, on the cap on...
I should just also say, it doesn't apply to iron ore processed in Australia, obviously.
Sure.
Right? So it also acts as an incentive for people to process minerals here. And if you look what's happened in Indonesia with nickel, they put the same sort of restrictions or other restrictions on, and they found their investment in the nickel. There's a lot of nickel refineries now in Indonesia. So we think it's sort of lining up with the market for Australia's interest.
Sure. But just on the capping of the home mortgage rate at 3%, Tom sort of asked about it. Borrowing costs for banks are probably going to be above that within 5 years. Are you asking banks to lend money at a loss, or would it only apply, and what would that do to people's superannuation and bank share prices, or would it only apply to money lent by banks at a lower borrowing cost than 3%?
Well, it could be that. You can take long-term borrowing at the moment at lower than 3%. Also that when we previously had home loans set by government, I realise it may be pre a lot of your lifetimes, but the government also controlled the deposit rate on savings. And there was always a margin between, say if it's 3, deposits could be 2. So there's also other measures that can be taken which are not just legislative, but the RBA and others have got a policy of cooperating with government once the objective policies are set. So you want to pursue all of those things, but the key thing on our agenda is to ensure that Australians can keep their homes and that their wealth is not dissipated.
Thanks.
James Elton from 7:30.
Mr. Palmer, thanks for your address. James Palmer. James Palmer. James Elton
Thanks,
from 7:30. Long lost child. I want to ask you, I want to take you back to last week on Budget Day. The UAP organised a very big event on the lawns of Parliament. There were mock notes representing Australia's $1 trillion debt.
I think they had Ned Kelly on them, didn't they?
I think that's right, yeah. There was also a stage on the back of a truck where your parliamentary leader here, Craig Kelly, spoke. But before he did, there was another speaker named Mark McMurtry who made a number of claims. He said that the Union Jack was a secret Jewish symbol and that by standing under it, Australians were effectively standing under the Jews, I'm quoting here, and what they represent. Now,
well, I don't think that was our party. There was a general rally on there as well, wasn't it, Craig? That wasn't our party rally, and it wasn't our party truck. Craig Kelly was invited to speak there, like other speakers were for other different organisations. And we just happened to be there with the $1 trillion of debt, which we were complaining about. That was our main point. And I know Craig wouldn't have said something like that. Is that right, Craig? I think I'm right. I was home in bed asleep, but I'm sure that's the case. And you have to condemn them. So anyone that says something like that, I just want to make it clear that I personally condemn, and I'm sure our whole party condemns. I'm sure you'd condemn that too when you're Craig, right? So there's no question that we're associated with anything like that.
Have you taken any steps as a party to try to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen again?
Yeah, we have. We've tried to make sure that we... this was something that happened off the cuff at 5 in the morning, when we normally ask to speak at rallies and things like that, we check who's organised them. We try to check who the other speakers are. And sometimes people lie to you, but not normally, right? So I think that that's all we can do. I think we're responsible for things that I say, things that Craig says, or things that our candidates say. I don't think we're responsible for other organisations that we're against.
Next question comes from Rob Scott.
Thanks, Mr. Palmer. Rob Scott from 7 News. I wanted to ask you if you felt comfortable detailing what medicines you received as part of that cocktail. And you obviously feel that they worked. Do you think that those sorts of alternative treatments, if you can call them that at this stage, should be made free to Australians?
Well, two things there. I don't know exactly what I got because I was unconscious at part of the time, right? So I
You
can't...
haven't found out since then?
Well, I'm trying to find that out. I'm just checking with Rob, but I don't personally know that. If I did, I'd tell you, right? But I understand they consisted of antiviral drugs in combination, right? You may remember when the AIDS packet, or you may not remember, but when AIDS originally was introduced, it was very hard to find a treatment to save people's lives. And finally, the medical profession decided on a cocktail approach where they took 4 or 5 drugs, they put them together and they got an effect, right? And that's what happens with AIDS just today. I think this approach is very much the same, where they've taken existing drugs that are already approved, right, for different indications, put them together, and that's the trial. I'm not sure exactly what the drugs were, right? But I will find out. But I understand they're pursuing that with the TGA as a treatment for Australians. But my point wasn't that treatment did save my life, but I know how I felt. I know what the other doctors told me was going to happen to me. But I'm sure there are other treatments that are happening in Europe and the United States because the vaccine hasn't saved everybody. Some people with the vaccine still catch COVID and they still die. And we should be trying to help those people as much as we can. And people that are unvaccinated as well catch COVID and they die. And, it should be about your second point. It should be about your own personal doctor who's familiar with your medical history having some input in what we're doing. At the moment in Australia in hospitals we have approved treatments for COVID, and they're approved by public servants who may be doctors, some of them, but they're the approved treatments that you can receive. So Australians, unlike people in the United States and the United Kingdom, are limited in what treatment they have and it's already prescribed to them. Now, they may have other conditions, they may have other backgrounds that treatment isn't suited for you. I know I wouldn't want to have public servants prescribing me how I carry out my business, for example, but, that's what's happening in the country at the moment. We think we need to spread it broader. We need to rely on doctors having the right to have a confidential relationship with their patient and having some input into the treatment rather than it being prescribed.
Next question comes from Masilia Ali.
Masilia Ali, SBS News. Mr. Palmer, in the last election you spent a lot of money not to gain any seats. So what is your measure of success? And if you don't gain any seats in the upper or lower house this time round, would you consider that a failure?
No, not necessarily, but I think we will get seats. And I'm very confident about that. We've got a much stronger team this time, and there's more need for our message this time. If you remember in 2019, we said China was a threat to us. We said there was a threat to our defence budget because of them having islands in the South China Sea. We had a number of prominent commercials about that where we were ridiculed about that. That wouldn't happen today because what we said has happened, right? So what we think, it doesn't hurt to have these issues before the public, and it doesn't. If we find that the Liberal Party and the Labor Party are avoiding an issue, I mean, why didn't the journalists, when they come to the press club, ask them about the debt and saying, it's going to take hundreds of years to get rid of it, how are you going to deal with it, right? It was just sort of glossed over. But it's really the fundamental driver of our economy, which is going to wreck our future. It's something the government should have as the highest priority. So I hope today's function, and I hope what we're doing between now and the election will raise these issues and raise the awareness, whoever wins the election, that they'll deal with these issues because they can't be put under the carpet. So I would be happy to see that happen for my country and for my fellow Australians.
Next question from Annabelle Hennessy.
Annabelle Hennessy from the West Australian newspaper. As has been pointed out, you spent millions in the last election, but UAP failed to win a single seat. You've recently launched multiple lawsuits against the WA government, which is an obvious drain on taxpayer resources and taxpayer money, and you've been accused of spreading health misinformation during a pandemic. It seems almost as if you enjoy causing controversy and creating havoc. What is your end game in all of this? Do you simply enjoy the attention? And how would you respond to those who consider you a vexatious litigant and dangerous to public health?
Well, the problem about being a vexatious litigant is I have never lost. I've only won. Vexatious litigants lose, you see. You know, I haven't lost any cases, and you'll see with the case of Mr. McGowan, your Premier, I won't lose that one either. But we've seen that the Attorney General in Western Australia...
You've referred to the Premier, you've likened him to dictators and Hitler.
Well, hold on, just let me finish. You'll see that your Attorney General has given evidence and now he's applied the court to change his evidence. So it would indicate that maybe they're not telling you the truth. But basically, you know, how I spend my money, I guess it's mine. I've worked hard for it. If I want to spend the money supporting papers that don't have an economic future, what's wrong with that? It gives journalists employment. It creates debate, and it's a valuable thing to do, rather than just leave it in the bank, get it into the economy. And if I lose that money, well, I can't complain, can I?
We've seen, though, you know, widespread misinformation about
Well, that's just not true. That's just your opinion. Yeah, there's no court orders.
It's not my opinion, though. This is multiple medical doctors, you know, have come out against your advertisement. You know, there's been widespread concern from the medical community.
Yeah, how do you think my life was saved? Because medical doctors contacted me and said, we've got to save you because you're the only person telling the truth about these drugs.
Who were these doctors?
They were doctors in the United States and doctors in Australia. That's the reality of it. So there's difference within the medical opinion. There's over 100 doctors in Australia that have been struck off and not been able to practice medicine in this country because they advise their patients not to get vaccinated. Now, you know, we believe it.
Just on that.
Okay.
Just on that point. So.
But I don't want to get into a debate about vaccination.
Well, just very quickly on that, because you brought that one up.
Yeah.
So, and the latest figure I had was 61 doctors from July 2019, well before the pandemic, had been struck off. 2 of them were for falsifying vaccination forms. That's as close as you get to what you were saying.
Well,
none of the others are for.
That's in 218 or 219, you said, right?
No, it's from then until now.
Well, there's people like Mark Hobart in Melbourne that was raided by the police and his medical records taken, right?
But your struck off number there is not accurate.
He's not allowed to practice anymore because he had a different point of view. I mean, in science and in academia, we've got to protect our universities because they provide us with diversity of opinion. We've got to encourage debate because they give us a different point of view. But suddenly in this, you know, one side says, well, I'm in favour of Pfizer. I mean, do you see John Skerritt? He put on a white coat. He's never been in the lab for 40 years. He's paid for by the government. He's a public official that has to approve things.
You've made your money through mining royalties, though. Who are you to be giving
He went on
advice?
television saying, buy this product. The regulator shouldn't be pushing a product for any company. That's a conflict of interest.
Nobody's buying the Pfizer vaccine. It's provided
Well,
them free.
he's asking for the demand to do it. So it's totally wrong for a government official to say, have AstraZeneca, have Clive Palmer's iron ore. He's got to be impartial if he's the regulator.
He's talking about
there's
getting
no
the vaccination
impartiality
rate up of the country because that will reduce hospital rates, help our hospital systems cope. That's the point of that message.
Well, that's what he says. But there's other academics in Australia, more competent than him, who don't agree with him, right? And there's other medical things. So the press should not be used to talk about misinformation. They should report the views from both sides and allow the facts and the public to make their decision. That's fundamental to the right to know.
You've referred a few times to the vaccine today, seemingly implying it can help, though. Do you think it's been a net benefit to the country?
Well, personally, I don't, right?
You don't.
But all I'm saying here, to me, what's important is we have the vaccine. It's there. It's a reality. People are taking it, and there are people who are not taking it. If either of them get sick, we should treat them equally, and we should try to treat them with compassion, and we should try to give them treatments to help them.
Okay.
But that's the positive way to look at it.
There's no one not getting treatment, from my understanding, who hasn't been vaccinated in Australia. Let's move on. Finn McHugh.
Finn McHugh at the Canberra Times. Mr Palmer, thanks for your speech, touching on a similar issue to what James talked about. A couple of months ago, when anti-vaccine mandate protesters were in Canberra, Mr Kelly signed in a man who is avowedly pro-Vladimir Putin, who has said on the record that he would like to see Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, quote, liquidated. Nevertheless, you stand here, you talk a lot about your concern about foreign influence. You claim to be a bastion of democracy and free speech. I'm just wondering why anyone should take you seriously, given the company that you and your party keep.
Well, hold on. Let me just go. Can I just ask you a question there? What do you mean signed in? Signed into Parliament?
Signed into Parliament.
Okay, I just want to get clear.
Yep.
That particular individual's been expelled from our party for having those views.
He was publicly endorsed
And his
by
endorsement.
Mr Kelly after he made the comments about
No,
Mr Navalny.
well, anyway, as far as I know, on the National Executive, as soon as we heard those comments, we cancelled his endorsement.
How are you not aware of the comments?
Well, I wasn't at Parliament House when he was signed in.
That's not what I'm asking
Yeah.
you. I'm asking how your party wasn't aware of those comments.
Well, we have a procedure like anyone else in this country. All Australian citizens, regardless of their views, are required to
It was
fair
a
and
quick
proper
Google.
process.
He said it on Four Corners.
Well, I'm just trying to explain to you, if you're a member of an organisation, you can't be dealt with summarily and shot. You have to be given proper process. So we sent a notice to him to please explain and give us your point of view, and he's got a right to say what he wants to, and the people considered it and they decided to expel him.
But why weren't you aware of the comments earlier, given that he made them in 2019?
Well, I wasn't following him in 2019. I wasn't aware of it.
But you could have Googled him. He said it on Four Corners.
I don't Google you. I don't Google everyone in the room, But once it was clear what he said, and once it was reported to us by the right one, but he was dealt with. He was given the opportunity to put his position forward. You can't say you believe in democracy if you don't give people proper process. It doesn't matter who the person is, what they say, you have to give them proper process so that no injustice is done. In this case, we gave him the opportunity. We thought the details he put forward weren't sufficient and his membership was terminated. Okay, much the same way as the Liberal Party did the other day, but they did it with a guy that challenged him in the Australian courts. They terminated his membership on the spot without a hearing.
Thanks.
We better move on. Akisha Napier-Raman.
Thanks, Mr Palmer. Kishore Napier-Raman from Crikey. As a couple of my colleagues have pointed out today, look, in the last election you spent about $80 million of your own money and didn't win a single seat. Now you're spending millions more kind of building a political brand around stoking scepticism about vaccines in one of the most vaccinated countries in the world. Now, isn't this a sign that, firstly, Australians aren't really, by and large, buying what you're selling them? And secondly, to any undecided voters out there considering voting for the UAP, why should they put their faith in the businessman that gets such poor returns on his investments?
Well, you don't need to worry about being in politics as not an investment, right? I think it was, was it the Australian that said I'd made $9 billion in the year, which I think is probably more than most people in the room have made. So I think I get a reasonable return from my investment. So let's deal with that one. But more importantly, I'm not here today talking about vaccines. If you've listened to my speech, what we've been talking about is economic policy for Australia, and we've been raising issues that had not been raised before about the level of debt.
Is that because the vaccines work? Is that why you stopped talking about them?
Sorry?
Is that because the vaccines work? Is that why you're not talking about them?
No, because I'm the Treasury spokesman for Craig Kelly, and it was advertised that I'd be presenting our economic policies, because many Australians, and I'm sure people of Crikey, would like to know what are our economic policies, whether you're for us or against us. We've got the right to say that. And my speech today has been focused primarily on the economic measures we need to take to save this country. Now, people can agree with them or disagree with them, but that's what I'm doing. And as far as the vaccine goes, my main thrust is that people who have the vaccine or don't have the vaccine, that we look to the future and ensure that they have the best treatments to save their lives. Now, I don't see anything wrong with that.
Okay. Tim Shaw is next.
Thanks, Tom. Tim Shaw, Mr Palmer,
Yes,
Director
Tim.
of the National Press Club. Great to have you here and thanks for your speech. The Reserve Bank and Treasury will be joining whomever has the Treasury benches after the election to look at a review of the RBA and also Treasury mechanisms. And to your point about home loans and back to the economic narrative, is that something that you personally would contribute in terms of a white paper development? You state that you're there in the interests of those homeowners. You don't want to see them lose their homes. But if you're not successful at the election, do you see a role for you and your supporters outside of the Parliament to be able to contribute? The Lowy Institute does it. The Judith Neilson Institute does it. Will we ever see the Palmer Institute of
Well, I don't know
Public
what it needs to be
Policy.
at Palmer Institute, but maybe I am an institute, I don't know. But
Well, you're a living national treasure.
I'm a
apparently.
national treasure, but
National living treasure.
but the truth about it is, I just think that everyone sees things differently based on their experience in life, right? Based on my experience in life, I saw these things coming, and I can promise you that I won't lose my home. But the problem was, I thought, I've grown up in a country where home ownership's been important, and this is a storm that's coming that hasn't been identified by our people, that it needs to be put out there in public. I've looked at what the possible solutions can do, and I've looked at how unfair it is to have Australians having to pay this $1 trillion of debt. And just by reorganising our business, if you want to call it a business, or our country, by bringing in an export credit licence like many other countries have for their commodities, we can pay the debt back in 20 years and nullify where we are on our balance sheet, if you want to call it a balance sheet. It's not actually a balance sheet. And that means we dial back to where we were with John Howard, and we start again, and we give people a lot of opportunities. Now, that's what I saw from my experience. But other people may see it differently. But certainly, we'd want to contribute those ideas to who's ever on the government benches. The happiest thing for me would be for Scott Morrison and Albanese to come down here and say, yes, we're going to do it, right? Because ultimately, it's not political parties that matter. It's the citizens of this country that matter, and protecting them and their wealth is important because we are in an economic crisis.
Thank you.
Next question from Julie Hare.
Mr Palmer, thank you. Julie Hare from the Australian Financial Review. I'm a director of the National Press Club. As of this morning, I think it's a real-time measure. The Forbes billionaire list for 2022 has you number 1,445, worth $2.2 billion, so I don't know what happened to the $9 billion.
I think the Financial Review had me at $9 billion last year. I think there's something, I don't know.
We'll have to go back and double-check that.
Yeah.
Fact check. Malcolm Turnbull has described you as transparent and not particularly ideological, and that your political motives are more to promote your personal business interests.
Well,
so, one, I would like to ask you, what are your political motives? And two, are we going to see a refloating of the Titanic?
I don't know, but I just don't think anything I do in politics is about business because it only costs money, it doesn't generate money. It's really about, being able to provide other alternatives for Australians, what we're doing, right? So it's not about business. I don't make any money out of politics. I don't make any money out of government concessions or lobbyists, right? So it's nothing like that. But what was the first part of your question? Because that was the important part, I think.
The billionaire ranking, 1,445 on the Forbes billionaire list.
I was invited by the Forbes brothers a few years ago over to Singapore. I was a guest speaker there. And they were very upset because I attacked their magazine and how they operated. Right. And ever since then, they've had a go at me. They've had me at $2 billion, where the Australian, I think, has got me at 18.5. Right. I mean, I earn about $650 million net a year, right? So I think, I'm worth more than $2 billion. But if it doesn't really matter how much anyone says you're worth, I think all that matters in life really is you've got someone that loves you, that you've got a good meal and a nice place to sleep. When you close your eyes at night, you'll be happy.
Okay. And I think we all really do want to know what's happening with the Titanic.
Well, with the Titanic, we finished... when the Titanic was first established, it took from about 1899 to about 1910 to do the design work on it. So we've commissioned a large number of people to do all the design work on the Titanic, and it's taken us 7 years. And we were ready to start construction on it in Europe just when the pandemic hit. But it hit particularly hard cruise ships, as you probably recall, right? So we decided to suspend it to see what happens with the pandemic and whether the cruise market picks up.
Okay, we've got one more question. I will just point out as well to our viewers that COVID-19 Clinical Evidence Task Force does still, for now, strongly recommend that people do not use hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. So that's just the message from the authorities at the moment. Final question now from Josh Butler.
Yeah, Josh Butler from The Guardian. Thanks, Mr Palmer. A large number of anti-vaccine mandate protesters have been in Canberra over the last few months. Both the group organisers and your MP, Craig Kelly, said the UAP was funding them to a certain extent, campsite fees, food, stage fees and that sort of thing. Last time the Prime Minister was in this building, protesters from that group surrounded it, claimed that senior politicians were on a secret pedophile list. One of the protest organisers called Parliament House a satanic building. One of them was found with a gun in his car. My
Well,
question
none of
is,
these
my, no,
people-
my question is, can you explain your support and encouragement of these groups? Do you stand by it? You told James that you can't be held responsible for the words of groups. Are you responsible for the groups that you fund?
None of those people are funded by me. None of those people...
One of them was signed into the building by Mr Kelly.
He might have been signed in the building. He may have been a party member. But I'm saying none of those protests and none of those views are views of the United Australia Party. We don't believe in any of that rubbish. And that's the reality. Most of those people also don't agree with our party and what we're doing. So, and we don't have protests down here. The only protest we've had down here, as far as the United Australia Party goes, is the one on Parliament House. But while this information goes out in the media by journalists about things like that, that's how these things carry, because unfortunately many of our journalists don't investigate things. No one's ever contacted me to ask me about that.
I have.
Well, I can't recall you contacting me.
I can't your representative.
Well, you just contact me. I'm available. Okay. I can answer questions. I'm happy to help you, right? You look like a nice guy.
There were UAP signs at the front of this building, though, to be fair.
Sorry?
UAP placards, the big yellow placards were outside the front of this building.
Well, there can be people that say you should vote for the UAP. Like, there's many Australians that want to vote for the UAP that are not our party members or not authorised spokesmen. I mean, I was a member of the Liberal Party for 40 years. I was the National Party's official spokesman for a number of years, and I can tell you that many people spoke about things that only I was authorised to talk about, and the press wrote stories about it. But I'm authorised for the United Australia Party, and if you need to know, give me a call and I'll talk to you.
Great, thanks.
Okay?
All right, well, on that note, Clive Palmer, you've been very generous with your time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Bye.